What do you celebrate? Usually, celebrations look back. For instance, at Thanksgiving, we look back at the Pilgrims and at the foundations of our country. We also look back at Thanksgiving at the past year and think about what it is that we have to be grateful for from the past year. You know, though, celebrations really build a sense of anticipation, though. I remember being a child in grade school. Celebrations from Labor Day right through Easter would mark the year and always give us something to look forward to, something that would keep the year moving. But then, from Easter until the end of the year, with just every day of school and no let up, it just felt like time died. Sometimes celebrations look forward to the future, as in weddings. Because when we gather to celebrate a wedding, what we are celebrating is the union of two lives and the love that they will share and the home that they will build for a lifetime. Now, in a similar way, as we gather this weekend, our celebration is about looking backward and saying thank you to God. We're looking back and saying thank you to God for the foundations upon which this church was built. We are very specifically saying thank you to God for our founders and for the ways that they built this church in the first place. We're saying thank you to God for Pastor Jay Abramson and for Liz and for the decades of leadership that they have given to this church. As we celebrate all of these things, though, the real thing that we're celebrating is the impact that this church has had for Christ. You see, that's the substance of the work of all of these people who have come before us. They have impacted our world for Christ. And that is the thing that we celebrate. It's not simply that things happened, it's that things changed the world around us for Christ. And so celebrating in that way gives us an eager sense of anticipation about what is coming next. Because as we celebrate our first 45 years of ministry, we are thinking about what God is going to do with the next 45 years of ministry. Because if Jesus tarries and doesn't return soon, and we have 45 more years of ministry, at the end of it, we want to have done things that are worth celebrating. Why? Because impacting the world for Christ causes celebrations. Impacting the world for Christ causes celebrations. In Romans chapter 10, verses 13 through 15, we discover a little something about the way that impacting the world for Christ causes celebrations. The Apostle Paul wrote, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news." Now in verse 13, Paul was summarizing an argument that he had been making for the past few chapters. Paul had been discussing how one connects with God and is saved. Paul even said that there had been an old reliable way to connect with God and know that one had been saved, and that was by keeping every piece of the law flawlessly. We had known for a long time that if we did that, we could connect with God and be saved. But Paul went on to say that a new way had been opened up for us to connect with God and be saved. And that was that if we believed that God had raised Jesus from the dead and confessed that Jesus is Lord, Paul said, then anyone can be saved through faith instead of by works, through that pathway, through Jesus. In fact, that's exactly what Paul is saying in verse 13. He's saying that as opposed to the old way of works, a new way of faith had been opened to God, and anyone who took it, anyone who called on the name of the Lord, anyone who believed in their hearts that God raised Jesus from the dead and confessed with their mouth that Jesus is Lord, anyone could be saved. But that led to a problem in verses 14 and 15 that he began to raise for us. Because he went on in verses 14 and 15 to say, well, okay, so how are we then to call on the name of the Lord? First, we have to believe. But, he went on to say, before we can believe, we have to hear. And that led to a problem. Before we can hear, someone has to preach, which leads to another problem. Before someone can preach, they have to be sent. And so the pathway that Paul outlined for us is that we can confess because we believed, we can believe because we have heard, we can hear because we have had the good news preached to us, and we can have the good news preached to us because someone was sent. And the fact that someone was sent was absolutely beautiful news in Paul's mind. In fact, Paul said the ones who had been sent, the ones who would do that proclaiming, would be absolutely beautiful. To describe how beautiful they would be, Paul drew on an image from Isaiah chapter 52. Now, at the beginning of the book of Isaiah, God confronted his people, Judah, and he said to them that they belonged to him in a sense through their ritual actions, but their hearts didn't really belong to him. And because their hearts didn't belong to God, that led them to do all kinds of things that were wrong. And they had been doing that for centuries. And God said, because your hearts don't belong to me and because of the things that you have done that are wrong, there are going to be consequences. The prophet Isaiah said that in years to come, an enemy would invade them, the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire would come to Judah. They would invade the nation. They would lay siege to the city of Jerusalem. They would destroy the city of Jerusalem by and large, and they would carry many of the people away into exile. Then in chapter 52, we're moving past that message of judgment to see a new day that would be coming. In Isaiah chapter 52, in some ways, we're looking ahead to the death, resurrection, return, and rule of Christ. But before that, there is a piece of good news that God's people, after being exiled to Babylonia, would return from that exile. In chapter 52 of Isaiah the prophet says that there is going to be one after the exile who will stand before God's people and say that God is in charge, that God is returning to his people, and that the people are coming home from exile. And that's the context in which Isaiah the prophet said, how beautiful will be the feet of the one who proclaims that good news. In fact, he was saying it is the best news that has been proclaimed since the Exodus itself. God will do a new thing, and that is cause to celebrate. Now, the Apostle Paul picked that phrase up. And essentially what Paul is arguing in verse 15 is that news that a messenger brought in the past was really, really good news. Someone stood before us as a people and pronounced that good news. Someone stood up as a messenger and said, God is in charge and God is returning to his people and the exiles are going to return home. It was the biggest celebration since the Exodus. But Paul is saying if that was a cause to celebrate, then what would we do with the news that we can have our sin forgiven? We can be adopted as children of God. We can be filled with the Spirit of God for living for God day in and day out, and we can spend eternity with God. Now that news, Paul said, that news would be even more worth celebrating. And so he picked up this phrase from Isaiah the prophet to say, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach that good news. What a glorious picture. The one who proclaims that good news has beautiful feet. It's such a joy to see that one coming. In fact, what he's talking about is impacting the world for Christ. And what he's saying is anyone who impacts the world for Christ has beautiful feet. and impacting the world for Christ is the cause for the greatest celebration. Well, God has equipped us, you and me, to impact our world for Christ. That's what Paul was saying again in Romans chapter 10, verses 13 through 15. He's saying that God uses us to do this job. Let me read those verses for you again. He said, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news." What Paul was saying is that impacting the world for Christ always comes down to the work of those that God has sent. God chooses to work through us to impact the world. He almost always chooses us to work through to impact the world. Now, what that means is that our founders realized something incredible about the potential that we have together as a body of believers. If you have been a part of this celebration, if you went to the exhibits at our celebration last night, you had the opportunity to see a video in which one of our four founders, Rooney Mincer, talked about the reason why this church was started in this place at this time. Rooney and our founders had a passion for the people, us, of the Farmington Valley. They knew about the people of the Farmington Valley, that this is a place where people have the opportunity to get the best education in the world. They knew about the people, us, that we work hard, that we're very talented, and that as a result, many of us are very successful. Now, in that video, Rooney was talking about the fact that well-educated, hardworking, talented, successful people tend to lean on ourselves to get through life. And that makes it difficult for us to recognize our need for God. But the flip side of that was that Rooney and the founders recognized that if well-educated, hardworking, talented, successful people turned to God and became followers of Jesus Christ, well, we could change the world for Jesus Christ. I have to tell you, my calendar and my inbox have been filled in the past 2 weeks with instances of Valley members and attendees changing the world. I had the opportunity to find out about a couple, a family here at Valley, who have made it part of their life's mission to provide everything that families transitioning out of homelessness back into a stable place to live need in order to set up housekeeping. And they have furnished homes for 17 homeless families recently. That's what they did to impact the world for Christ. I found out about another Valley family that this couple has chosen to intervene with police officers, state troopers, with firefighters, with emergency medical personnel, with military service people, and with veterans when they face the crisis moments in their lives. They come alongside them in these crisis moments and help them to find stability and point them to Jesus, that they might change the world as well. I heard again about a Valley family that grew up here, that have attended here for years, that decided to relocate their family to France. They are now world outreach partners of ours. And in France, they're sharing the good news about Jesus with the Muslim people who have moved and made France their home. They are impacting generations for Jesus. And I received the latest prayer update from a Valley member who grew up in this church and who now lives in Thailand and is working for an agency that fights human trafficking. And they are bringing people out of human trafficking, introducing them to Christ, and helping them to build new lives outside the industry. They're changing an entire society for Christ. This is the people that we have. That begins to bring to life our church's vision statement. Our church's vision statement just eloquently summarizes the dream that our founders had, and it states it very eloquently. Our vision is to build a community of believers who actively impact our world for Christ. That was the dream that started this church. That is the dream that fueled this church for the past 45 years. And that's the condition that we sit in right now. Our vision is to build a community of believers who actively impact our world for Christ. Now that has an implication. And I hope you begin to understand the implication. Because the implication is that you are the one God plans to use to impact our world for Christ. You're the one. You're the one through whom this happens. You see, this church has always been focused on the glory, the truth of God. But beyond focusing on the glory and the truth of God, this church is also focused on you. That's our job. Our job is to bring together believers in Jesus Christ, to build a place where those believers can belong, to build into believers, to equip believers with every bit of knowledge and every tool that you need, and to champion sending you out. After God, you are the focus of this church. I hope that thought causes your blood to pump a little bit faster. Because I hope you recognize that you are the plan God has for impacting the world for Christ. It's you. God has equipped us to impact our world for Christ, but going on, we find that God has called us to impact our world for Christ. Let's go back to Romans chapter 10, verses 13 through 15 again. And what you're going to see is that Paul is seeing a world out there. He's talking about the method of reaching them, but he's seeing the people themselves. He wrote, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news." And now, as Paul wrote this, Paul could see a lost and dying world. And he passionately wanted to reach that lost and dying world. Paul could see that his own people, the Jews, had for that season turned away from him, and that broke his heart. He longed to see them reached with the good news about Jesus Christ. But Paul could also see already the impact that his work had had in his lifetime. He could see the impact that he'd had in the land of Asia Minor, where he had been on all of his missionary journeys and planted and strengthened churches each time he went. And he could see the impact that he could have as he was writing the letter to the church in Rome. He could see that God was calling him toward Rome, and he was dreaming about the impact that he could have by ministering among the people in Rome. But he could see beyond that. He was believing that God had called him to go to Rome in order to raise funds, in order to go on to Spain and preach the good news about Jesus there. Paul could see the implication that there is out there a lost and dying world that needs to hear the good news about Jesus. So he said, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. How beautiful are the feet of those who impact the world for Christ. You see, we recognize where our calling is as a church. We know that first and foremost, our calling is to the 3.1 billion unreached people in this world who have little or no access to the gospel. Carrying the gospel to the nations has always been fundamental to who we are as a people, as a congregation, as a church. It has been since the beginning. But within all of the unreached people of the world, we have focused our efforts on those who have limited access to hear the good news about Jesus. And we've said we want to go there. But within that, we have focused our scope as well to unreached people groups who are Muslim in faith now, because we look at them and we empathize with them. We see that they long to live righteous lives, and we recognize that if they heard the good news about Jesus, seeing their lives changed could be dramatic, and it could change the world as well. So we know that we are called to the 3.1 billion people who have little to no access to the gospel around the world. Beyond that, we are called to the 900,000 lost people in Hartford and Litchfield counties. Since the very foundation of this church, we have been about reaching out to our neighbors and sharing the good news about Jesus with our neighbors. And we recognize that it's not easy because well-educated, successful, driven, high-potential people tend to lean on ourselves to solve our problems in life, and that makes it difficult to share the good news that God is the real solution to our lives. But we have done it since the beginning of this church. We have opened our homes to our neighbors. We've invited people to join us in the faith. We've served our community. We have planted churches. We have opened campuses. We have done bold things since the beginning of this church to reach our neighbors for Christ. That's where we're called. And we as a body of believers are also called to the next generation, to children and students and young adults. And from the foundation of this church, we have recognized that they would be critical to us. We cannot ever see our children, our students, and our young adults walk away from the faith. And since our beginning as a church, we have valued and prioritized our children, our students, and our young adults. And they live in a more difficult context than they have ever seen. They deal with troubles that many of us never had to deal with in life. And it is incumbent upon us to reach out and prioritize them in the future of this church. And we have, and we will. We have, and we will. But that leads to a question, and that is, how will God use you to impact our world for Christ? How will God use you to impact our world for Christ? Because I've been talking about the ways that we are called together. And we know how we are called together. Together we are called to the 3.1 billion unreached people in the world. We are called together to the 900,000 lost people in Hartford and Litchfield counties. We are called together to reach the next generation of children, students, and young adults with the good news about Jesus. That's how we are called together. But the call that we have together can never be used to limit or stifle the call that God has placed on you. Because you are the one God has raised up in this day, at this time, in this generation. And where God is calling you is the place where you will be most effective at impacting the world for Christ. The rest of us want to equip you, pray for you, stand alongside of you, release you, watch what God is doing through you, help you when we can, and celebrate the things that God does through you. How beautiful are the feet of those who impact the world for Christ. How beautiful are your feet when you impact the world for Christ. God has equipped us, God has called us, and God has sent us to impact our world for Christ. Back in Romans chapter 10, verses 13 through 15 again, what we find is that God has indeed sent someone. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. So Paul is arguing that someone has to be sent because he's asking questions that we know the answer to. How are they to call on someone in whom they have not yet believed? Well, they won't. And how are they to believe in someone of whom they have never heard? Well, that's not going to happen. It can't. Pretty much. And how are they to hear unless someone preaches the good news to them? Probably won't happen. And how is someone to share the good news with them unless they are sent? And there is the focus of what Paul is saying. Someone has to send those who will share the good news. God has sent people to share the good news. And God is sending us to share the good news. You see, this point at which we stand right now is the beginning of our next 45 years of ministry together. We have gathered together this weekend to celebrate the past, to celebrate our founders, to celebrate our great leaders, to celebrate our foundation. As we celebrate each of those things, they leave us with a legacy and with a moment and a choice to make. Because you see, our founding generations are in the process of handing that legacy to us. And the question is, what will we do with that legacy? As that legacy is handed to us, how will we receive it? Will we take it? Will we own it? Will we step into the gap? Will we choose that legacy as our own? And will we choose to be the next generation that impacts our world for Christ? Brothers and sisters, this is our moment. This is our very odd moment. These past 18 months have been, to coin a phrase, unprecedented. But here's the simple truth of the matter. God has not been surprised by pandemics. God has not been surprised by anybody's reaction to pandemics. God has not been surprised by anything about this moment in history, this odd moment in which we all find ourselves. God has also not made a mistake in putting us in this moment. He put us in this moment on purpose because we are the ones He chose to live at this day, at this place, and in this time. God did not make a mistake in that. He chose us and He fitted us for this day. And God did not make a mistake in putting us in this day, in this time, and in this place together. He gave us one another in this day, this odd moment in history, this time, this place, that we together might impact our world for Christ. This day, and in this place, in this time, here is the commitment that I will make to you. I will do everything I can to equip you to impact your world for Christ. I will teach you faithfully the Word of God, and I will teach you everything that I know about making and multiplying disciples of Jesus. I will provide you the context in which you can know people and figure out together how to follow Jesus, where you can belong. I will do everything I can to provide you with the very best tools that you need to serve God. And I will do everything I can to provide you the places to serve so that you can practice using those tools. And I will do everything that I can to show you places where you might use those tools to impact the world for Christ. I will do everything I can in this moment to equip you to impact your world for Christ. What will you do with this moment that God has entrusted to you? As we begin our next 45, let that question linger in your heart. How you answer that question determines how we will bring flesh to our church's vision in this day and in this age. May God use our beautiful feet to impact the world for Christ.